Welcome to our channel. For those of you who are new around here, we're Pal Tiya International and we created a sculpting medium called Pal Tiya Premium that looks and feels just like clay but cures stone hard. Check out our other videos to see for yourself what's possible. In part 1 of this project, we showed you how we made the shell armature. And it's been curing and now it's ready for the detailed layer. But before we do that, we must open, clean and restore the core. So using screwdrivers or chisels, pry the 3 sides apart along each seam. A lot of your strength comes in this scratch coat, as you'll see by how solid it was to remove. As you go, clean the core of loose bits and repair the surface with more hot glue and foil. You'll apply a new waistcoat of foil for when you use this pattern next. Time to clean the 3 parts of the shell. Spray a light mist of water first. This will keep the dust down. We often employ the use of pliers to get those tricky bits of foil out from the armature. And then using a fork, we scrape the remaining parts out. And then using a wire brush will just get you a nice clean inside surface. Once you've done this on all sides, you'll have 3 really sparkling clean pieces to work with. So here we've reassembled the shell scratch coat just to show you what it looks like before we begin holding it together and doing the detailed layer with Pal Tiya Premium. For this shell, the scratch coat was 5mm thick and the detailed layer was 5 to 10mm thick because it had lots of frills and different textures and things like that. So it's time to begin applying the detailed layer. But first we need to make sure that all the seams of the shell are essentially glued together with Pal Tiya Premium. When we first started this project, we intended to never paint it, so we decided to use a yellow and white oxide mix. So that's what we're doing here, just mixing that together before we do our pre-texture test. In the end, we decided to paint the whole thing, so this was kind of a wasted step, but this just shows you how to, if you wanted to, add an oxides into the product. So this was our pre-texture test. Practicing the texture is essential for sculpting your final piece, because on the day of sculpting you can make confident new decisions based on experience. The shell ended up with a variation of this texture. In the test, the big mounds were established in the foil base. On the final shell core, these mounds were not present. We decided to build them up against a smooth surface and do the texture together.
So now I'm going to pounce this down into essentially those sinusoidal lines, because there's blumping and shifting, and I now need that to look like very, very smooth, like none of this stuff, none of that stuff. It has to be this undulating surface wave.
Yeah.
If you don't get that at this point of the game, it makes everything afterwards so much harder to get. So you go to the trouble of creating that beautiful, beautiful wave. No blumps, no lumps. Okay, now I take the highest point of these things and I do essentially creating
a series of
pinched. They have to be cones.
Yeah.
So I bring that up and I cone it to there. I cone that one. And some of them can virtually disappear, but each one has to be pulled up into a little tiny pointy mound. There's so much deliciousness going on. So I choose a little batch and I turn every line into these low mounds. They don't exactly have to match, meaning I can put a lot more of these little tiny ones in, or occasionally I can pop it up to a big one. But they all have to be shaped. So if I put this one in here, I shape that to a pointed mound. Then I can actually go some distance away and shape the next bit into a mound.
And in each row where you're doing that, you're probably offsetting it to a degree. Like they're not uniformly all in the same line.
They're not all uniformly in the same line.
Right angles to your groups.
And yeah, because sometimes, there is a polar line. This is equatorial. This is polar. Some of these lines are going to match up, and they ought to. But what you don't want is rigid uniformity. Some shells have rigid uniformity. I find that not terribly interesting. Once you get into a rhythm, it's pretty much 5 strikes of the tool makes a cone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do it again. 1, 2, 3, 6. Like that. And you try to be tidying it up as you go along. You don't want the surface fracturing too much. So when it hits that waxy state, then you begin to shape those cones into quite pretty cones. And that lumpiness and knobbliness begins to just sing on the surface. It's quite lovely. So now I can do a really rapid tap. Can see it stiff like this? So suddenly those are a lot faster to achieve than before.
Yeah.
Because it was taking me a long time to dance with the fibers. Now, you always try to keep the fibers below the surface on this stuff. So see, it moves just a little bit faster.
It does move faster.
Yeah, it has to reach that state.
So now we've got this sort of almost like big dinosaur leathery texture to it. What's the next step?
Pouncing.
Pouncing.
We're going to spray it slightly with water, and then we're going to pounce it, and that should make everything into mounds. And then we go back through and we point all of the mounds. Missed it. Pounce. But you can see that it's all starting to blend together.
Yeah,
I'm forcing the stuff underneath. It's got the consistent lines.
All right.
Now I have to make sure that that is completely and absolutely and utterly pounced to within an inch of its life. Because it's stiff enough, it doesn't slump over. If I'd done this too early, it would not have the structural integrity. And I got to make sure there's no ledges left anywhere. So they look like bricks, right?
Yeah, they do.
Now we have to get rid of that brickness. They all have to soften. Now we have to go through And we have to make sure that each of those looks like a cone. And so you're getting rid of the bricky edges,
Yeah.
and you're making them look like little tiny pimples and blisters on the surface. Make them round, not square. There's a point where it's quite stiff and you can move quickly, but again, slowly, slowly. Some of them we can just absolutely make go away.
You'd actually just
You're just shrinking them because you don't want them all the same uniform. Some of them are very, very low shapes. Okay, so I'm going to widen that line out. Yeah, that's starting to look better. You can see as I open them up, open those valleys up, it just looks a lot more hard and dense, like individual blisterings. Just every once in a while, do a line that's interesting, but very particularly around these deep ends here. Do a little bit there, and now pounce it again. See what we've got. And I'm going to go through and just kind of make certain areas look pretty, bring up the blisteriness of it. That's so the tool slides on the surface slickly, because I do want it to continue to blur stuff. Really wide. Because you don't want them all absolute uniform. You want them parallel. Now I'm going to drag like this, and that starts to clip those corners back without me going around every single darn one again. I can just clip the corners in the vicinity. Now we're going to make sure there's no more fuzzies. All the fuzzies need to go away. Okay, so I'm going to just draw little lines that sort of float around like that.
Now those lines are bifurcated. We can see that one.
That one went a little too far.
Yeah.
Sculptures have to look good upside down too. Some darknesses, you don't want the whole thing to be flat, because that's boring. Don't have to draw lines in everywhere. Occasionally you need super dark piercings, just to remind yourself that you're alive. And so that adds that little flicker of additional texture.
Yep.
This test texture looks good because the low cone shaped bumps are properly blended together in parallel lines. We used the opportunity to create more elaborate features than originally intended. High elevated ridges were made instead. A series of puffy bumps were built on top of them and fused into the needed mounds. Each of the bumps kept the cone shape established in the test and were blended down as carefully. The grooves between the bumps became the important texture, and we concentrated on giving these grooves greater variety in depth and width. The lines simplified everything. The intense, tiny bumps were kept, but clustered instead around the big knobs and frills. A good final scratching put a uniform weathered texture over the entire piece. After this, the piece will need cured for several days, up to 28 days for a full strongest cure. From armature to textured shell to another shell that we made, it was time to paint. And we covered up our lovely oxides with white and then put our paint job over the top. And here is the final painted piece. Time to pop it in the garden. And there we have it, the beautiful giant shell. Don't forget to become a Pal Tiya Insider and get access to bonus content offers and more.